France, in my opinion, a really interesting market at the moment that offers a number of opportunities. And I think in general, there's currently a lot of excitement about European real estate, certainly for us at Schroders. If you look at overall conditions, GDP forecasts have been upgraded for many continental European countries, and continue to be upgraded. We see unemployment starting to fall, consumer spending is growing, economic sentiment is very high, and many of the forward-looking indicators in the economy actually pointing to a further acceleration in growth. Inflation remains in general moderate, and businesses, governments, and even consumers sort of still benefit to a certain extent from QE. And of course, this is all to do as well with the fact that the political uncertainty has eased. At the start of the year, I used to have a slide in all or many of the presentation I'm delivering to clients, just outlining the events we were anticipating during 2017. Article 50 being triggered by the UK. We had elections in the Netherlands, in the UK, in France, in Germany. And I think overall, the outcome of these elections have been widely regarded as very positive. And yes, it took more than, 200 days to agree on a political coalition in the Netherlands. Yes, we still need to see what kind of coalition will be formed in Germany. And yes, on a global scale, there remain risks, if you talk about Syria, North Korea, maybe US foreign policy, Ukraine, and maybe closer to home, the things that are happening in Catalonia. But it seems that many investors and decision makers are much less concerned about this. And I won't mention Brexit here in detail. I'm sure it will pop up in the panel discussion later. The newspapers seem to have declared Frankfurt already as a bit of a winner, but I also think that Paris will gain from Brexit. I do also get the impression that the sentiment on the continent seems anyway more that it is Britain that has a little bit more to lose in this game and the process than the EU 27, at least at the way the discussions or the negotiations seem to pin out at the moment. I guess I could present on France for 2 hours straight, but as Richard said, my aim here is really this morning to set a bit of scene, touch on a few interesting aspects, and look at some of the numbers just to help us facilitate the discussion later. Now, looking at France, I guess most of us here were quite happy to see that Macron won the presidential elections, and he was also able, or his party, La République En Marche, was actually able to also secure a fairly good majority in Parliament. Macron stands for quite a European focus. Is very open to further integration on the European stage, and as of course promises a number of in-depth reforms, including labour market reforms, to restore the competitiveness of the French economy. I think he has set himself quite a task here. Many governments before him have tried and ultimately failed in these reforms. I think his election has sparked some optimism and is perceived as, providing a stable government and a proactive government. But I would also argue and caution a little bit that a lot of the future growth potential for France relies heavily on how much of these reforms he can actually push through. And just on the side, we should not forget actually that the Front National actually got quite a number of votes, and we've seen, things in Germany with the AfD, in Austria with FPÖ, so we shouldn't forget there is sort of still this kind of right-wing or more populist movement on the side. But I guess, again, when we look at France, a lot of optimism here on how things are going to turn out. Now, Juncker, in his address to the European Parliament, famously said, the wind is back in Europe's sails. And I think that's also true then for France. GDP growth has been improving further, and unemployment in Q2 actually fell finally below the very psychological 10% mark to 9.6%. And some good news also on youth unemployment, which is something that never is really sort of really looked at in a lot of the reporting, but I think it's very important because it has a very big social impact, but also youth unemployment is finally reducing. It still stands at 23%, but improvements there. And this and the sort of Macron effect is really pushing up economic sentiment. And what is nice to see is that GDP forecasts for this year, next year, were actually upgraded over the course of the year. At the start of the year, we were looking at 1.3% for this year and 1.4% for next year. And now, as in the consensus forecast here for October, we stand at 1.7% for both years, so quite an upgrade. Well, how does this compare with other European countries or continental European countries? Well, of course, you have countries like Spain, which continues to perform well despite what's happening in Catalonia at the moment. And other countries see growth rates upgrade as well. I mean, in the Nordic countries, for example, Finland was one of the countries that has seen an incredible upgrade in their GDP growth forecast. But I think these countries are still at the very, very start of their recovery. What is important to remember is that while the downturn in 2000 or in the wake of the global financial crisis was uniform, the recovery across Europe hasn't been. So a couple of countries were really starting to start growing again straight after the global financial crisis. And in other countries with the sovereign debt issues, this kind of growth has been postponed, or the start of the recovery has started only a lot later. So we have many countries across Europe at different stages in the economic cycle. But I think France certainly looks very much in a stage now where momentum is definitely accelerating. Now, looking at the country's largest market, Paris, or if you want better, the Ile-de-France region, the economic momentum is clearly filtering through into the office markets. I think there's always a discussion, especially across European researchers like myself, about the definition of what is the Paris market. But I would actually argue that, if you look at the wider Ile-de-France region and, the market that branches out from actually the city of Paris, into the neighboring arrondissements, with about 53 million square meters. This is, for me, the largest office market in Europe, and about 20% of French GDP is actually generated in the Ile-de-France region. If you want to compare that to Germany, for example, if you add up the GDP contribution of the big 7 markets in Germany, you get to around sort of 18% of GDP. It shows you a little bit as well how important the Paris market is for France and what kind of dimensions we are talking here about. And what you can see is that occupiers have really released the brakes and are actively looking for space. There's quite some good take-up here. Q2 of this year was a bit quiet, probably a little bit over the elections, but the Q3 numbers have been released now by some of the major brokers, and it saw actually activity rebounding, and I think for the whole of 2017 we'll finish on another quite active year. And what is also very encouraging to see that it's not just occupiers moving, so just generating take-up. We're actually looking at occupiers that take on additional space, indicated here by the positive net absorption. Well, this kind of recovery in demand has clearly led to a decrease in overall market vacancy. But as you can see here on the map, Paris remains a very polarized market. Vacancy in the city of Paris, or the 20 arrondissements, is extremely low. Whereas in other areas like the Northern Bend or in the Péri-de-France, vacancy is still quite high. The good news is here that over the last 12 months, we have actually seen vacancy decreasing in most of the submarkets. But I think it goes to show that Paris is a very diverse market, and that, in my opinion, it's more than ever about understanding the location and understanding the dynamics in your submarket. Now, looking ahead, it looks though as if there is a supply response coming on the horizon. Space under construction seems to increase again. Is that a reason to worry? Well, I don't think it's an issue for many of the central submarkets where vacancy is very low. You see a lot of this under construction also includes refurbishments. And if you have vacancy rates of around 2-3%, well, then any additional supply is actually probably most welcome. I don't necessarily think it's an issue elsewhere. That's because there remains a strong demand for new and modern space that is energy efficient, and space that has sort of efficient floor plates, because that's really what occupiers nowadays want, a space where they can implement new workplace strategies, new configurations, and use the space more as a business tool to drive productivity and attract and retain people. And that kind of specification is quite scarce in the in the Paris market. But I guess, construction activity is something we should nevertheless keep an eye on. I mean, you see here the figures for La Défense as well, like 7% of stock. Well, is that worrying? Look, I'm still, I wouldn't say a big fan of the La Défense market, but I think La Défense is a very established business hub. It has all the amenities you want. It is very well connected in terms of transport, and compared to the CBD, it offers large floor plates and lower costs. So, I know there have been reports in the press as well about sort of more supply coming, more towers being delivered. But at this stage, for the next 2 to 3 years, my concerns about that are rather muted. And overall, the market appears to be quite balanced. A very strong absorption here in the last 2 to 3 years, and for this year. But again, keeps this polarization in mind. Overall, given the current demand, and particularly for modern space, I think we should see, in some cases, more rental growth coming through, because I think what we can also see in the market is that incentives are starting to reduce, or have reduced in some of the central parts. There's also 2 things, in my opinion, that create excitement and opportunity and will transform certain areas in Paris. First of all, the Grand Paris Express, one of the largest transport infrastructure projects in Europe. We're talking about more than 200 kilometers of new tracks and 4 new metro lines, all developed till 2013. Just to give you a comparison, I think Crossrail, or Crossrail 1, if Crossrail 2 ever comes, but Crossrail 1 is about sort of, I think, 120 kilometers of tracks. So we're talking about almost double that in terms of additional capacity. I think it will significantly increase the ability for certain areas, the accessibility of certain areas and attractiveness of a number of areas. And finally, because, finally what you don't have to do is, if you want to commute between certain submarkets, you don't have to go into central Paris and then come out again to the very congested heart. There is a way to connect, or the Grand Paris project will connect sort of the submarkets between each other. So it's really, to improve the connectivity between certain suburbs. And the first area to benefit very likely is the south of Paris, with the stretch of the first stretch of the metro line number 15, now under construction. So it's actually happening. The diggers are out. It's not just happening on paper. You actually see the development going ahead. And another area that, in my opinion, also we see an uplift is the area around Saint-Denis, because it will sort of, if you look at the map, it will sort of become a quite attractive transport hub, because from Saint-Denis it will be very easy to travel into the CBD. It will be very easy to travel to La Défense, and it will be very easy to travel to Charles de Gaulle Airport. So, it's certainly an area that has come up on our radar. Saint-Denis also nicely takes me to the other big thing, and that's the 2024 Olympic Games, where Saint-Denis will also see a lot of the action. The venues are scattered across the region. I'm just showing, sort of on this map here, I'm just showing some of the venues in central Paris. A couple of events are held a little bit further outside, but the Stade de France in Saint-Denis will become the Olympic Stadium, and Saint-Denis will also be home to the Athletes Village, the Media Center, the Aquatic Center, and maybe less so in terms of visitors, the Water Polo Center. I'm not sure how attractive water polo is, but I might be wrong. And what is interesting here, that these new build, everything that will be newly built for the Olympics in Saint-Denis are actually permanent structures. And I know the impact and the legacy of Olympic Games is always sort of controversially discussed. I do think, though, that there's undeniably sort of a marketing effect for Paris, and we shouldn't forget that Paris is also the world's most visited city. I'm not sure if it's actually the world's, but it might be the world's. Just before I get quoted wrong, definitely Europe's most visited city. So I don't want to go as far as saying that the Games will transform maybe the Saint-Denis area as much as the London Olympics did to London's East End. But it does in parts just remind me of that. If you go to Saint-Denis at the moment and look around, it's an area that could do with some improvement. What is also encouraging, I think, is that the plans for the Grand Paris Express were all made and approved before the bid for the Olympics was submitted. And together with the Games, I think it gives me a certain confidence that many of these projects will be delivered on time. Well, Paris is obviously an important part of France, but there are opportunities elsewhere. We're currently seeing very strong population, GDP and employment growth, both in the west and the south of France, and these regions are or will be also benefiting from an extension of the TGV network. And if you say, well, these markets may be apart from Lyon, a little bit too small or too illiquid for me in terms of office investment, well, maybe then retail or logistics might be a great options. It's no secret, Schroders, for example, we've recently acquired 2 retail schemes, one in Rennes and the other one in Anglais, Biarritz and Bayonne, because the fundamentals here in terms of the employment growth and the population growth, are just make a very convincing case. Retail is, of course, interesting, and retail and consumer confidence is improving. Retail sales are forecasted to grow further. However, I think we also need to be aware that a lot of this growth might actually be happening online rather than on physical store floor. E-commerce is very prominent in France. There are a couple of very innovative concepts like the drive-through from the big supermarkets, and as in Germany and the UK and the Nordic countries, it creates winners and losers. So I think a big shopping center with which dominates its catchment, which has a leisure offer and the big food offer is probably going to perform very well. Some smaller schemes, which are not that dominant in their catchment and which have a high fashion share, might actually feel some pressure. So when it comes to retail, I think more than ever it is very important to be selective. Well, maybe some logistics then. Well, the economic upswing and the structural changes from e-commerce, with many operators restructuring their networks, is definitely driving demand. Take-up has been very high recently, particularly in Paris and Lyon, and vacancy, depending on which agency, brokerage advisor you go to, I think is reported to be around 5%. And as in the office sector, there's strong demand for modern space, so space where operators can introduce new technology, a lot of automation, where you can charge your electric vehicles, all that kind of stuff is very high on the agenda. We also must not forget that the parcel business or logistics business is a business where it is a tough business when it comes to margins. There's lots of competition, and all of that plays into sort of the demand for logistics space. I think there's also a bit of a supply response here in the logistics markets, with the first signs of a little bit more speculative development coming through. And of course, that kind of occupier momentum in terms of strong demand and low vacancy, is driving investor demand. And still, obviously, the yields are sitting a bit higher than for your good office product or your good retail product, and that's also driving investor demand. So as in many other markets in Europe, logistics investments are quite active and are quite attractive at the moment. Looking at investment volumes, just to close this off, the French market did see already a very active 2015 and 2016. Well, this year looks as if Q1 and Q2 somewhat were impacted by the uncertainty created by the elections, and Q3 maybe a little bit lower because of the summer holidays. But looking at the news tickers, for example, PropertyEU, you start to see a lot of news coming through about deals that have been closed or that are in negotiation. And my feeling certainly is that we will see another very strong year for investment in France. These numbers here are just looking at traditional commercial real estate, so office, retail, logistics. But as in other parts of Europe, we also see an increase in investors looking to alternative sectors. So that's something that is also happening in France. About 2/3 of the investment so far this year has come from domestic players. On the other hand, there's German investors, there's about 10-15% of that, and then others include still US investors, Asian capital, the UK, and you also see some of the Middle Eastern capital occasionally active. And yields have, of course, seen strong compression across the board. That's a story we can always see across Europe. But remember, these are sort of your prime yields. So, when you look at a 3% yield for offices in Paris CBD, it might be worth remembering that in some of the suburbs, in this very diverse market, you can still get, your 4 or 5% if you choose carefully. Maybe take on a little bit of leasing risk and look where maybe the uplift from the Grand Paris project might come in. So I think that gives us a lot of points to discuss, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of interesting opinions coming out. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Oliver.